12 human beings have walked on the moon. All of them came back. None of them ever fully explained why we stopped going. The official answer has always been money, but money did not stop us from building space telescopes, launching Mars rovers, or maintaining a permanent station in orbit. Something else stopped us, and the man with the answer spent 50 years staying quiet about it, until now.
The man who was already there. Something about the moon never sat right with him. For 50 years, Charles Duke stayed quiet because of where he had been and what he had seen before he ever stepped onto the surface. During Apollo 11, Duke sat in mission control as Capcom, the only voice allowed to speak directly to the astronauts. "Liberty, this is freedom. Do you read me? Liberty, this is freedom." When Neil Armstrong said, "The Eagle has landed," that was not just a line. It meant the lunar module had touched down safely after a descent filled with alarms and fuel running dangerously low. Duke responded, "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." That was not a joke. The entire control room had been holding their breath because the landing was seconds from failing. The lunar module was running out of descent fuel. The fuel needed to slow down and land safely on the moon. Neil Armstrong had less than 30 seconds of that fuel left, and as he approached the surface, he saw the landing area was filled with rocks. If the fuel ran out, he would not have been able to land. The spacecraft would have crashed, or they would have been forced to abort at the last second. Duke's words were pure relief after realizing they had just avoided disaster. Neil took manual control, guided the spacecraft to a safer spot, and landed just in time. Duke's words were pure relief after realizing they had just avoided disaster. That is the level of pressure Duke lived in, and he carried that into everything that came after. Before Apollo 16, he had already trained for Apollo 13 mission, the mission that almost ended in disaster. An oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon. The crew lost power, lost heat, lost normal oxygen supply. At one point, they were close to freezing and suffocating at the same time. The entire mission turned into a fight to bring them back alive using improvised solutions that were never meant to work in space. Duke trained knowing that was a real possibility. He understood that space was not exploration, it was survival. And then there are the parts of his life that people rarely talk about. At one point, Duke's personal life fell apart under the pressure of his career. His marriage was breaking down. He later admitted he had become distant, consumed, and emotionally unavailable. The same focus that made him reliable in space was quietly damaging his life at home. Then came something even darker. After returning from the moon, Duke went through a period of deep inner struggle. He spoke openly years later about feeling empty despite having achieved something almost no human ever will. Imagine walking on another world and still feeling like something is missing. That kind of silence changes a person. So, when Apollo 16 launched in April 1972, Charles Duke was not just another astronaut. He was a man who had already seen how close everything could come to collapse. He spent 71 hours on and around the moon, and when he came back, something about him felt different. There have long been quiet rumors that for days after the mission, he barely spoke to anyone. Some claimed he would just sit there, staring into space as if still trying to process something he could not explain. Others said he looked very lost and scared, and at times suffered from intense headaches and even bouts of vomiting, as if what he experienced had not fully left him. And then, just as suddenly, he went silent for 50 years, until now. What he says actually happened begins with a mission that looked on every piece of paper completely routine.
The mission that was supposed to be routine. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972, carrying a crew of 3. John Young was the mission commander, a veteran astronaut who had already flown to the moon once before on Apollo 10. Ken Mattingly was the command module pilot, responsible for keeping the spacecraft in lunar orbit while the others descended to the surface. And Charles Duke was the lunar module pilot, the man who would stand beside Young on the moon. 3 highly trained, carefully selected professionals on what was expected to be one of the most scientifically productive missions in the entire Apollo program. Their destination was a region called the Descartes Highlands. Geologists had chosen this location deliberately. The highlands were believed to contain some of the oldest rock on the entire moon, material formed during the earliest and most violent period of lunar history, billions of years ago, when the solar system was still taking shape. Scientists expected to find answers there, ancient, undisturbed geology that would fill in critical gaps in what we understood about how the Moon, and by extension the Earth, came to be. The mission objectives were clear and straightforward. Duke and Young were to deploy scientific instruments across the surface to measure moonquakes, solar wind activity, and cosmic radiation. They were to collect rock and soil samples from highland terrain that no previous mission had ever reached. They were also tasked with pushing the lunar rover across more challenging and uneven ground than any earlier crew had attempted, testing both the vehicle and their own ability to navigate difficult terrain. Young and Duke landed the lunar module named Orion on April 21st. Over the following 3 days, they conducted 3 separate moonwalks, referred to as EVAs, which stands for Extravehicular Activities. The first EVA lasted over 7 hours. The second exceeded 7 hours as well. The third ran just under 6. In total, the 2 men spent more than 20 hours working directly on the lunar surface, traveling over 16 miles across the highlands in the rover, and collecting 211 pounds of geological samples from multiple locations. Everything was being monitored from the ground at all times. Every word spoken between Duke and Young was recorded. Every reading from their suits, their oxygen levels, their heart rates, their exact positions on the surface was being tracked in real time by Mission Control in Houston. If anything had gone wrong, the people in that room would have known about it immediately. And nothing did go wrong. That is the important thing to understand. Apollo 16 was running smoothly. No equipment failures, no medical emergencies, no unexpected deviations from the flight plan. By every measurable standard, this was one of the cleanest missions in the history of the Apollo program. The Descartes Highlands were supposed to give humanity a quiet, undisturbed look at the Moon's ancient past, predictable geology, known science, controlled exploration. Roughly 5 hours into their exploration of a flat stretch of terrain called the Cayley Plains, they had been out on the surface for hours. The work was going exactly as planned. And then, on the horizon, something caught Duke's eye that had no business being there.
The Moon has no atmosphere at all. Not a thin one, not a partial one, none. Sunlight hitting the lunar surface arrives completely unfiltered, white, harsh, and absolutely uniform across everything. Shadows are pure black, because there is no air to scatter light into the dark areas. No color variation, no softness, no gradients. What you see is exactly what the physics says you should see, and nothing else. Duke had been observing exactly that since the moment he stepped outside. The surface was behaving exactly the way every training manual said it would. During the second EVA, as Duke and Young drove the rover deeper into a specific area of the Cayley Plains, Duke noticed that the light was different. The white sunlight he had been working under for hours had developed color. Soft blues and greens were appearing in what should have been a completely colorless environment. There was no equipment malfunction that could explain it. There was no atmospheric phenomenon, because there is no atmosphere. The color had no source. Duke looked over at Young. Young was seeing it too. They reported it to Houston immediately. Houston gave them no explanation and told them to continue with their activities. That alone should have stopped everything. It did not. The second anomaly hit them in the same area, and this one is harder to explain away. Sound cannot travel on the Moon. With no atmosphere, there is no medium for sound waves to move through. The only audio Duke and Young could physically hear came through their radio systems or through direct vibration contact with their suits and equipment. But in that same stretch of the Cayley Plains, both men began hearing tones through their helmets. Not static, not radio interference, tones. Harmonic sounds that resonated and held, almost structured, almost rhythmic, with no origin they could identify. They reported this to Houston as well. Once again, no explanation was offered. They were told to proceed. The third anomaly was time. Duke described specific moments during the second EVA when his perception of time became unreliable. Tasks that should have taken a few minutes felt like they were over in seconds. When they checked their timers, the recorded time was accurate, but what Duke was experiencing on the inside did not match what the clock was showing. Something in that area was affecting his perception in a way he could not control or explain. The fourth anomaly was the one Duke found hardest to put into words. Throughout their time in that region, both he and Young felt they were being watched. Not a vague discomfort, a sustained, specific sensation of focused attention directed at them from somewhere they could not identify. Something was aware of them. Duke was a military test pilot who had spent his entire career learning to suppress exactly that kind of psychological distraction. He could not suppress this. Young felt it too. All four of these anomalies, the colored light, the impossible sound, the distorted time, and the feeling of being observed, occurred in the same concentrated area of the Cayley Plains, the same area they were still driving through. When Duke looked up at the horizon, he thought at first it was a rock formation, a ridge, something the terrain had thrown up at an odd angle. But as they drove closer, that explanation stopped entirely.